Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would review this little video and talk about this subject that I thought would be very particularly interesting. And the reason why I thought that I would review this little video and talk about this video, especially from this channel that I've never reviewed before, and kind of this topic and this this video on this channel that I ended up stumbling upon. I believe that the name of this video is Truth at Absolute. When it comes to his channel, I believe that he mainly talks about boxing. I've never really seen his channel before. And, he doesn't have a super big following. I think that he has about 1,500 subscribers. Of course, I'm not a channel that has the most amount of subscribers either. But like I said, I like to review certain opinions and I like to review certain topics and subjects from pretty much, a lot of different channels, no matter how big they may be. And the reason why that is, once again, is because I think that I can kind of kill two birds with one stone, get my perspective out there, and as well get a little bit of their perspective, because their perspective and my perspective is not just going to be shared by one person, it's going to be shared by many people. There's a reason why certain channels like Dante's Boxing Nation or Aki TV, even though I heavily disagree with most of what they have to say, there's a reason why they have a bunch of subscribers, because they have a whole bunch of people that tend to mainly agree with a bunch of their notions, even though I find most of their notions to be highly racially motivated and and very, very much politically motivated. There's a reason why they have, a certain amount of subscribers, because a certain amount of people do believe the same things that they believe in. But what I wanted to talk about today is this Terence Crawford versus Canelo Alvarez situation. And I was doing a live actually earlier today, which unfortunately I had to end because my PC and my laptop, it just was not really up to par for the task in terms of having a live. It was very laggy and buggy, and I believe that it had kicked me out of the stream multiple times. So I do apologize for ending it a little bit early, but I did have a multitude of people that gave their comments and also their perspectives, and certainly a great thank you to those who joined. And I'm sure that I'll do that another time, and whoever wants to join live, they certainly can. But one of the topics that we ended up talking about on that live, and one of the fights that, of course, people have been talking about recently, has been the Terence Crawford versus Saul Canelo Alvarez fight. And one of the topics that we talked about the live is that what is the reason for Terence Crawford taking the Canelo fight? And I believe that one of the gentlemen that I had on there, I cannot remember the gentleman's name, unfortunately, but he was bringing up a thing and he asked me the question, do you think that Terence Crawford is just taking the Canelo Alvarez fight for a payday? And let me just state this very quickly. Even though I can understand why a certain amount of people who would think that a fighter, even on the caliber of a Terence Crawford, I would understand why you think he's going for a payday, because on the surface, of course, it pretty much looks impossible in order to go up 2 or 3 weight classes to beat a fighter, and not just any particular fighter, but a great fighter in that same sense, like a Canelo Alvarez. But let me tell you this, I personally do not believe that Terence Crawford is going in there for a payday. I think that Jermell Charlo went in there for a payday against Canelo Alvarez, and I think that he thought that if he saw Canelo Alvarez maybe at a very inconvenient and weak moment, that maybe he would take advantage. But I think that Jermell Charlo knew what that pretty much was going to be, which was that he was going to run around the ring and not really try for a whole 12 rounds. And let me also tell you this, because there was a person, I believe that the name by Casey Cook or maybe something else like that, who at certain times is in my comment section, and he was talking about the Bernard Hopkins fights, against Jermaine Taylor the other day. And he said, well, Bernard Hopkins really should have won those fights because in both fights, he outlanded Jermaine Taylor and they really robbed him. Those are looked at as controversial. I've watched both Jermaine Taylor versus Bernard Hopkins fights. They were both very close, but I thought that Jermaine Taylor especially won the first one. Now, to be fair, the second one I haven't watched in a really long time, so I can't tell you. But you cannot completely judge a fight off off a punch stats. And the reason why that is because when you take a look at it, for example, Jermell Charlo, if you actually take a look at it, he threw more than Canelo Alvarez in that fight by a decent amount. But you could tell that he wasn't really trying in that fight, at least when you talk about actually trying to win the fight. Because Jermell Charlo, first of all, knew that he was nowhere near on the same level of boxing ability as Canelo Alvarez, because if he truly thought that, he would have actually gave it a significant effort. And B, he pretty much was only there for the payday. And the reason why Jermell Charlo, in my personal view, was only there for the payday is because he's seen that the winner of the Terence Crawford versus Errol Spence Jr. fight was going to be one hell of a tall task. And you could tell that every time Jermell Charlo either talked about one of those two fighters, he was starting to get a little bit either angry or a little bit talkative about one of those guys, or you could tell that his demeanor was starting to change. And when you see someone's demeanor starting to change when they talk about a particular fighter, that means that they look at that fighter in a particular different type of dissection or in a particular different type of way than what they do in other fighters. And I've mentioned this before. Once again, one of the topics that we also talked about was David Benavidez versus David Morrell. And let me tell you this, David Benavidez is usually a shit talker. He's also usually a bully when it comes to his up-and-coming opponents. But David Benavidez is a little bit worried about David Morrell. Now, I predict David Benavidez to beat David Morrell, but the way that he's talking and some of the things that he's bringing up, I've never really heard him bring up some of that stuff before. And like I said, certain people, they take a look at certain guys like Tyson Fury talking all this shit at the press conference and they say, oh, he's scared and blah, blah, blah. Well, Tyson Fury, that's not really super out of character for him. When you take a look once again at someone that all of a sudden is out of character and you say, what's going on with him? I've never seen him like that before. He seems super quiet. He seems a little bit more boisterous. He seems a little bit more talkative. The reason why that is, once again, is because they realize that that guy is a little bit of a threat. And they're projecting a little bit that I realize that this guy is a little bit of a threat and he's going to be different than some of the other fighters that I have fought. But anyways, just to continue, with the conversation, I do not believe that Terence Bud Crawford is coming in here for a payday. I believe that he's coming in here, and I believe that he's coming in here to try and actually beat and win against Canelo Alvarez. Now, do I believe that Terence Bud Crawford more than likely will probably end up on his bicycle against Canelo Alvarez? And do I believe that more than likely he'll probably feel Canelo's power very early on and more than likely get on his bicycle and then eventually that he probably asked for a little bit too much or that it's more than likely going to be too tall of a task? More than likely. But I don't think that it's going to be on the same level of a Jamel Charlo, who clearly from round one and from the beginning of the opening bell, clearly really didn't have a great motivation in order to actually win that fight in terms of on a real level. He pretty much came in there for the payday. It is what it is. But anyways, the reason why I'm going to explain as the video goes along. But this man here, he's going to be talking about Mr. Terence Bud Crawford, and he's going to be bringing up certain points that I would agree with and certain points that maybe I would not agree with. But I just thought that I would talk about this channel because it seems like a decent channel, even though, of course, it doesn't have the biggest following. But he's going to bring up some points that I thought were very particularly interesting. But let's get into it. Let's see what the man has to say.
What up, y'all? It's your boy Martin, aka the Boxing Purist. Welcome once again to the Truth and Absolute channel, where I speak the truth and nothing but the truth. So help me, good God Almighty. All right, y'all. Now listen, if this is your first time to the channel, make sure that you hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, drop a comment down below. We love engaging in boxing chatter. Anyway, let's get right into this one. But before anything, I gotta be a show off right now, man. And one of my subscribers really blew my head up, man. Check out this shirt right here, bro. This shirt is a fight 25 years ago, Tito Trinidad versus David Reed. And one of my subscribers actually sent me a couple of shirts, which I'm not going to front. It blew my head up. It's the first gift ever received by this channel. And much love, my man. You know who you are. Thanks for all that you do, brother. Thanks for your support.
Just to talk about Mr. Felix Tito Trinidad very quickly, just to talk about him. Of course, for those of you that do not remember Mr. Felix Tito Trinidad, I believe that he was a champion all the way from the welterweight division all the way to the middleweight division. I think that he was a three-weight division champion. He was particularly skilled, but of course he did have some flaws. He did have certain problems with quick-footed fighters and fighters that would move around him relatively well. That's why he had a lot of problems with Oscar De La Hoya and Bernard Hopkins and certain other fighters like that. I mean, of course, he was majorly outsized against Bernard Hopkins, but, it is what it is. But anyways, that being stated, the point that I actually want to bring up, because whenever it comes to the Antonio Margarito situation, and it's mainly usually talked about whenever people talk about the first Miguel Cotto versus Antonio Margarito fight, I always, bring up the fact that, in my personal view, Antonio Margarito, he probably did more than likely cheat in that fight against Miguel Cotto with plaster of Paris hand wraps. And you always get a certain amount of fans, especially certain Mexican boxing fans that back in the day really liked Antonio Margarito, especially because he was able to beat Miguel Cotto and, eventually become a champion at the welterweight division, I believe. They of course, claim that, Antonio Margarito, he was really wearing down Miguel Cotto in that second fight, he would have been able to stop him just like in the first fight. Well, in order for you to allege that, you would have to allege that, A, that Miguel Cotto looked as damaged and as wore down as what he did in the first fight. And for those of us that actually know what we're watching, he didn't look anywhere near as wore down nor damaged as what he did in the first fight. And of course, what certain people would say is that, well, Manny Pacquiao really ruined Margarito. He wore him down. He broke that eye and blah, blah, blah. And that's partially true. But keep in mind that Miguel Cotto also was stopped at that point in time 2 separate times in his career. And Cotto wasn't just stopped, he was beaten and battered on 2 separate occasions in that career. So he was never quite mentally or probably physically the same fighter ever again, even though he would still continue on to have a great career. Now, of course, how does this connect to Felix Tito Trinidad? The reason why I bring this up is because whenever I bring this up, I always have certain Mexican fans, or I always have certain people that say, well, if we're going to have these standards with Antonio Margarito, how come you don't bring it up with Felix Tito Trinidad? Because basically the standards that I've said about Antonio Margarito, I don't really count any of his wins really before he was caught cheating. I don't count the win that he got over Sergio Martinez. I don't count the wins that he got over Kermit Cintron. I don't count the win that he got over Miguel Cotto. I don't count any of those fights. And the reason why I don't count any of those fights is because it's not even like he was just caught on steroids. He was caught with a cheating method overall that is literally illegal in every single place of the earth. Now, steroids, of course, is illegal as well, but so many of these boxers are really using that technique anyway. Behind the scenes, it's just that they pay off a certain amount of these doctors or, the VADA commissions or some of these other guys so they don't get caught. Or they're working with the SNAC program, who pretty much is hand in hand, with overall some of the PED fighters, or like someone like a Victor Conte. But when it comes down to it, Antonio Margarito was literally able to improve his level of power by an immense amount because he was putting something harder on his hand wraps and within his gloves. Now, of course, when certain people use the retort about, oh, well, Antonio Margarito, overall, if we're going to use the standards with him and not count any of the wins, how come you don't do that with Felix Tito Trinidad? Because, Felix Tito Trinidad, he ended up getting caught with something in New York. Felix Tito Trinidad, even though a certain amount of people, of course, they do bring up certain points like he wasn't a big puncher in the amateurs, but then all of a sudden he became a big puncher in the pros and blah, blah, blah. Listen, what I'll state is this. If you find anything enough fishy on Felix Tito Trinidad that you want to bring up a certain point overall, then be my guest. Maybe I would have to acquiesce that, okay, that seems a little bit fishy. And of course, certain people would say, and Fernando Vargas, he said that it felt like he was getting punched with pebbles or rocks in his gut, blah, 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 all sort of shit. But what people mainly bring up is that Felix Tito Trinidad, that he got caught in New York, I think when he was about to fight Bernard Hopkins, that the way that he wrapped his hands, that it was illegal. Well, this is the difference between that situation. When Felix Tito Trinidad was caught with, wrapping it in an illegal way in New York, the way that Tito Trinidad wrapped it was only illegal in the Commission of New York. It was only illegal in that particular commission. So it would have been legal in Puerto Rico. It would have been legal in Vegas. It would have been legal in Texas. It would have been legal pretty much almost anywhere else. And that, that's the same point that a certain amount of these LDBC and new media channels try to bring up with Inouye, about him allegedly stacking his hand wraps and him wrapping his hands in a different way. Right, but Inouye's, wrapping techniques are not only legal in Japan, they're pretty much legal everywhere in America. What Antonio Margarito did, when he was caught in the Sugar Shane Mosley fight, and more than likely used probably for the majority of his career, especially in some of his bigger fights, that's a method that is not legal on any place on the earth. It is not legal in any particular place. So when people try to make that correlation of Antonio Margarito and Felix Tito Trinidad, all you're really showing is that you have really no idea what the hell you're talking about. And once again, just to go back to the point of the Miguel Cotto versus Antonio Margarito rematch, there was no way that Antonio Margarito was going to be able to stop Miguel Cotto, because not only had Miguel Cotto really adjusted his game plan, but on top of that, you could tell within the first fight that Cotto was going to eventually be stopped, because by the 7th or 6th rounds, even though he was winning completely the first half of the fight, Cotto was very clearly starting to get hit with some very, very good shots. And the way that his face was bleeding and the way that it was so marked up and the way that he was so battered, you could tell overall that eventually he was going to be stopped, because some of those uppercuts and those punches, they had such a vast impact. It was so brutal the way that he was getting hit, and they just had such sledgehammer effects. And also Cotto's arms are starting to get tired, because Antonio Margarito was hitting his elbows, he was hitting his shoulders, he was hitting his biceps, he was hitting all those arms. But interestingly enough, once Antonio Margarito got caught, he never, ever had the same level of power ever again. Isn't that very particularly interesting? And he had, I believe, a 10-round unanimous decision over a fighter by the name of Roberto Garcia, someone who, of course, was tough and had a decent chin, but isn't that very interesting? Margarito knocking out championship level guys like Miguel Cotto and Kermit Cintron. But then once he gets caught with illegal hand wraps and is not really allowed to use that technique ever again, isn't it very interesting? He never seems to have the same sledgehammer punch ever again. So these guys that say that Cotto would have got stopped in the second half of that fight, well, you'd have to allege that Cotto looked as damaged as what he did from the first fight, and he clearly wasn't. So once again, when people try to make that point, they really have no idea what the hell they're talking about. Do I believe that Antonio Margarito cheated even before he was caught in the Sugar Shane Mosley fight? Absolutely, 110%, no doubt about it in my mind. Do I believe that he cheated in the Miguel Cotto fight? Absolutely, 110%, no doubt about it in my mind. I have no doubt about it in my mind whatsoever that Antonio Margarito was using illegal plaster of Paris hand wraps. No doubt about it.
You've been a day one supporter. Thank you. Anyway, man, let's get right into this one. So, the talk about Canelo Crawford seems to be dying down a little bit now, but for a minute.
And once again, not to go too far into, not to digress too hard, but for those of you that are interested, within the boxing history of it, Fernando Vargas, of course, he said something along the lines of, oh, well, it felt like, I was getting hit with pebbles or rocks, blah, 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 all this sort of stuff. Well, listen, there are certain fighters that have stated that before, like Gabriel Rosado, who, interestingly enough, he was a Puerto Rican fighter. Good little contender, but never great. He stated something very similar when he fought Gennady Triple G Golovkin. But, the thing is that he said it a while later because he knew more than likely that at that time that it would probably sound stupid. Unless you have some sort of further evidence or proof, I'm not really going to claim that. And there's no offense against Fernando Vargas, but he always had a big fucking mouth, but he never really showed through unless it was the Winky Wright fight. He won really one huge fight in his career, then pretty much got his ass whooped against any other elite fighter in his career, whether it was Trinidad or Oscar De La Hoya or all those other guys. So Fernando Vargas is a guy that probably would make that type of excuse anyway. That's just the type of person that he was. And that was probably the most damaging fight for him in his career because Felix Tito Trinidad had knocked him down about several times in that fight, and that was his first defeat. And Felix Tito Trinidad heading into that fight, he was looked at as the guy that was more chinny than Fernando Vargas and a guy that could have potentially gotten knocked out because he was a guy that was known for getting knocked down a little bit early in fights. I don't know if Fernando Vargas was, and Fernando Vargas was looked at as exceptionally talented, and I believe that he was the youngest 154 champion ever. And Felix Tito Trinidad, of course, he whooped his ass. So Fernando Vargas, he's probably never going to forgive that loss because that is going to be always the most impactful for him on his brain because that was his first official loss. Boxers and fighters never forget their first official loss. That's always going to be the most impactful for them. At least, overall, if they never are the same ever again after that. So Fernando Vargas, fighters like Fernando Vargas, once they were never really the same again after that, they're never going to forget that first loss.
It was kind of amping up, but now we're seeing, articles out there, whatnot, that Canelo's team has reached out to William Scholl's team for a possible unification fight in May 3rd, or in the month of May, which is probably setting up a bigger fight for September. A lot of people are not going to like it. A lot of people are going to say he ducked Bud now, just like they said he ducked Benavidez. But I see this as being
Well, listen, it's very obvious that Canelo Alvarez has not really had a great interest in fighting David Benavidez. It just is what it is. And listen, I like Canelo. I think that he's a fantastic fighter. I think he's an all-time great, debatably the greatest of his generation. When you compare him to certain fighters like Usyk and Crawford and certain guys like that, in a way, even if you want to put him up there, certain guys like that. But especially Usyk and Crawford, because other than Canelo, those are the other two that I think that you can really compare him to as the greatest of this generation. But when you talk about it, listen, it's very obvious that Canelo Alvarez has pretty much made it very tough in order for the possibility of the David Benavidez fight to happen. Now, what I will state is this, because we also talked about this in the live, and, some people, I brought up the point that it's very possible that Canelo Alvarez may have told Benavidez's side that if you can win a light heavyweight title, or if you can beat Artur Beterbiev, or if you can beat Dmitry Bivol, or if you can possibly solve my problem at 175, because I want to possibly become an undisputed champion there, then I'll fight you. And I think that is very possible that Canelo Alvarez is looking at the 175-pound weight class right now and stating that I want to fight the potential winner of the unified fighter there. I want to fight the best light heavyweight in the world who has all the belts or is clearly looked at as the best guy. Now, what one of the guys in the live said, well, to me, that doesn't really make much sense because Canelo didn't really perform very well against Dmitry Bivol, right? But people must understand this. Canelo Alvarez has been looking at the light heavyweight division for a very long time. And not only did he fight Sergey the Crusher Kovalev, he fought Dmitry Bivol. We also must remember that Canelo Alvarez had aspirations at one point in time to fight at the cruiserweight division, and that he also, there was even talks about him potentially even fighting at the heavyweight division at one point in time, which is pretty much ridiculous for his size. But I mean, overall, once again, Canelo Alvarez is a type of guy to where he believes that he can possibly beat some of those 175-pound guys. But Canelo Alvarez is not going to fight all of them. Canelo Alvarez, is at a point in his career, and to be fair with you, or to be real, Terence Crawford is also at a similar point in their career. To where if you take a look at Crawford and Canelo Alvarez right now, they're not going to fight all these several A-grade level fighters in a row. Canelo Alvarez is turning 35 years old this year. He's really about a 39-year-old fighter with the amount of wear and tear and the amount of fights that he's really had in his body. And Crawford is 37 years old. He's not a spring chicken. He's not getting any younger. So these guys take a look at it. They want to be remembered. When you take a look at Canelo and Crawford, the way that they talk, they don't just want to be remembered as great fighters. They want to be remembered as debatably the greatest fighters ever. That's the way that they want to be remembered. And Canelo looks at it and he says, am I really going to be remembered as the greatest fighter ever if I just beat David Benavidez, and all this other stuff, which is a potentially very losable fight for me? So Canelo Alvarez takes a look at it and he says, why the hell would I really want to fight David Benavidez or David Morrell? And I'm not stating that that's necessarily okay, because at the end of the day, you're the 168-pound unified champion. You have to fight the guys that are looked at as the most dangerous there, or give up the belts. That's my personal opinion on it. But Canelo Alvarez is not going to fight David Benavidez and David Morrell 2 fights in a row, and not going to fight all those guys when he realizes that more than likely that he's only got a little bit of time left and he wants to be remembered as the greatest of all time. And certain people, once again, they said, well, that doesn't really make much sense because he didn't perform well against Dmitry Bivol. Right, but if Canelo Alvarez can beat the unified winner, and if he can beat Artur Beterbiev, for example, who says, he beats Bivol in a rematch and then he beats the winner of Benavidez versus Dave Morrell, then Canelo Alvarez gets in the ring with Artur Beterbiev and beats Artur Beterbiev, he can get credit basically for all the wins that Artur Beterbiev ended up getting. And that's how certain boxers end up thinking. Floyd Mayweather Jr. ended up thinking in a very similar sense. That's what he did with Canelo Alvarez. Instead of fighting both Austin Trout and Canelo Alvarez, he said, okay, what I'm going to do overall is that you two fight each other, and whoever the winner of that is, not only is that going to make our fight bigger, so I get even more credit for that win, but on top of that, I basically get credit for both of those fighters because I ended up beating the guy that ended up beating that guy. So I think that's what Canelo Alvarez is thinking when it comes down to it. And I think that Crawford takes a look at it at a very similar point with Canelo Alvarez. I do not believe that Crawford, once again, is coming in this fight to lay down if this fight does end up happening. And Canelo Alvarez, like I said, it wouldn't shock me at all if his side or if his team told David Benavidez that if you can handle business at 175, we'll give you the fight. If you become unified at 175, because that's what Canelo Alvarez plans to do. And I believe that Canelo Alvarez does want another shot at 175, but he realizes that it's not going to happen with one fight with Benavidez, and then the next fight against Bivol, and then the next fight against Artur Beterbiev. He has to fight only one of those guys, because Canelo Alvarez realizes at this stage in his career, pretty much the same with Crawford, they pretty much only have one mega fight left within them, really, even if that, because they're just aged. It is what it is.
Tune-up fight for a fight in September, which I'm not saying take William Skull lightly, but ultimately that's probably what it is. But I've been doing
Well, William Skull is not an elite level fighter. Pretty much everyone knows that has seen highlights of him or watched some of his fights. William Skull, of course, is from the Cuban boxing school, but he is not really an elite level Cuban boxer. It is what it is. But once again, I believe that Canelo Alvarez has a possible plan, and I believe that that's the plan that he is probably trying to draw out. But certain things are going to have to go according to plan. And then on top of that, if Benavidez ends up losing to either Bivol or one of those guys, then that pretty much gets the hype off of, his back, or that gets, some of the pressure off Canelo's back. So a certain amount of his fans or a certain amount of the boxing world will say, this is the guy that you wanted Canelo Alvarez to fight. He just lost to Beterbiev in dominant fashion, or lost to Bivol in dominant fashion. Now, of course, certain people will say, well, that doesn't really make any sense, because would people think that Canelo would really beat Bivol at Beterbiev either? Probably not. But that's not how most boxing fans think. Most boxing fans and most people don't really think that deep. Canelo Alvarez and Crawford and some of these guys, a big part of some of the moves that they make, it's not just based overall on certain fights that they want to take. It's also based on certain things of how they know their legacy is going to be looked at. And certain guys like these and top grade level athletes, they don't just think on the same level overall and say, overall that, oh, I'm going to do this because this is the best of what I think is for my career. They also do things based on what they know, how the majority of people are going to take a look at their legacy. And that's why boxers, especially, they get very sensitive overall when you talk about their resume, because what that basically means is that they realize that history is not going to look great within them, or they're not going to look great upon them, which is pretty much the exact reason why I believe that Crawford really wants to take this Canelo fight. But I'll explain as the video goes along.
A lot of thinking, man. And when I got to rename these videos when I say I've been thinking about a certain topic, okay? Now, my man Terence Bud Crawford, and you guys know I'm not hating because you guys know that I'm a fan of Terence Bud Crawford, right? So let me break it down. So in the beginning when this was...
And you know why, he has to say certain things like that, and he's going to have to say this several times over the video. You know why he has to say that? Because many boxing fans, or many fans in general, that's exactly what they are. They're fans, and they're very highly emotional. And if you say something that is even the slightest bit amount of critical, you're already quote unquote hating. And it's even worse with Terence Bud Crawford because he's a great black fighter. So a certain amount of the demographic that's going to be following Terence Bud Crawford is going to be these idiots that come from the LDBC and new media fanboy channels that basically say, how come you're critical of Terence Bud Crawford? Would you do this with Canelo? Would you do this with Usyk? You're a racist, you're all this sort of stuff. So Terence Bud Crawford, the big part of the reason why someone says, I'm not hating, especially when it comes to a black fighter with Terence Bud Crawford, even if it's somewhat truthful, the reason why they have to say that is because you're automatically going to be claimed as a racist, because a lot of these fucking morons from the LDBC and new media channels, that's how they think, and once again, they don't think with real logic, they just think with emotion. I had one of these idiots in my comment section for my last video where, he said overall that, you're talking about just anti-black nonsense, and overall, this is just another anti-black channel, blah, blah, blah. And then I asked him the question, why do you think my channel is anti-black? I asked him, I said, what did I say in this video that you disagree with? And the only thing that I got from a response from him is that you're projecting. He gave me no logical answer. He gave me no that. You know why? Because he doesn't have a logical answer. He's just coming from an emotional standpoint. Once again, I get some of these guys that come on my channel, then they actually watch my videos and actually realize what some of my stances are, and then they realize that what they originally thought that I was about, that I'm not really about whatsoever. Because once again, you got to watch the video through and through, and you also got to see what my stance is. You don't just take a look at the title overall, or guess, what my channel is about. You have to take a look at it.
I'll talk about the fight of Bud possibly moving up to 168 to challenge Canelo Alvarez. In the beginning, I was like, okay, you know what? He's signed to Jive Turkey. He's rolling with Turkish Al-Sheikh. He's doing his thing, obviously.
And Turkey Al-Sheikh, even though I think that he's been doing some good things for boxing, he better fucking calm this attitude down. Because Turkey Al-Sheikh is basically trying to take over boxing with this, I'm going to do it my way attitude and all sort of bullshit. Listen, that's fine. But when it comes to the sport of boxing, you must understand the business side of boxing. And when you're talking about someone like a Canelo Alvarez, dude, he's not just going to acquiesce to your demands. Like, Canelo Alvarez is still the main face of boxing. He's been the main face of boxing for really the past 7 to 10 years. Excluding, of course, Mayweather and a guy like Pacquiao. But, of course, Mayweather, I think, retired, at least when you talk about fighting professional boxers, I think all the way back in 2016. So the thing is like, or maybe 2015, I can't remember. But, but anyways, when it comes down to it, Canelo Alvarez, who's made millions, and on top of that, he's been the main face of boxing for years, has a great resume, and he's pretty much been looked at as debatably the greatest fighter of his era. He's not just going to overall give in to your demands overall, and acquiesce to you trying to publicly embarrass him. Canelo don't give a shit about that. Canelo Alvarez overall is like, listen, man, if there's something in it for me, and if you want that Terence Bud Crawford fight, if you want this fight, you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. You're going to have to offer me a certain amount of money, or there's going to have to be something in it. So Turkey Al-Sheikh, even though I think he's doing some good things, he's got this attitude to where overall he's just going to take charge, and that you do whatever I say overall, or I'm going to publicly embarrass you. That's not going to work when you talk about certain guys like Canelo Alvarez or Gervonta Tank Davis, bro, because they don't exactly need you in order to make big fights. Canelo Alvarez is a dude that has made 550 to 650 pay-per-view buys within his last 2 fights, and it wasn't even one of the main fighters that people wanted to see him against. He made 550,000 pay-per-view buys against Jaime Munguia, and then against Edgar Berlanga, he did even more than that, I believe. So once again, Turkey Al-Sheikh, with this attitude that he's got, he's going to have to be a little bit more graceful or try to work with Canelo Alvarez on the business side of boxing a little bit more. And I understand the attitude that he has, but you must understand the business side of boxing, and you must have a little bit more overall ability, to be a little bit more cordial than what he's being, because Canelo Alvarez is not going to work with you being like that.
Turkish Ala Sheik Jive Turkey is trying to make big fights happen, and who else to get into the ring but a Canelo Alvarez? Now, you could tell that Jive Turkey is a casual fan because he's looking at this, and no one has to say it to me. This is just what I think. He's looking at it like a Canelo versus Mayweather Part 2 because Terence Crawford is a real talented fighter. He's real skillful. He has a high boxing IQ. You know what I'm saying? All of the above. So I see what Jive Turkey is looking at, but it's just unrealistic because they're two whole different worlds when it was Mayweather Canelo and the possibility of Bud versus Canelo. Now, this is why I'm going to have to keep it real.
Let me also state this, because people are stating overall that they said, well, if Terence Bud Crawford really wants to fight Canelo Alvarez, for the 168-pound titles, he should fight one of the top contenders there, that deserves a spot. And although I get the mindset from the business side of boxing, they would never do that shit. And a big part of the reason why that is because, first of all, a big part of the reason why this fight really has so much appeal in the first place is because, whether people really want to admit it or not, pretty much everyone knows that Canelo Alvarez is not really a guy that belongs at 168 pounds. And I know that a certain amount of people are not really going to agree with me. Yes, Canelo is a bit girthier. We all understand that. But when you talk about Canelo Alvarez, the man is 5'7" with, I don't even know if he has 71 inches of reach. He is shorter and not even as lengthy as a Floyd Mayweather Jr., who really belonged at a welterweight division at max. So I mean, once again, Canelo Alvarez, a big part of the reason why certain people are really promoting this fight is not only because they're two great fighters, but people know that Canelo Alvarez overall is really not a great, overall sized, guy for a super middleweight guy. He's just not. He's not greatly sized. That's not Canelo Alvarez, because I promise you, if this fight was, let's take Crawford versus David Benavidez, no one would even be paying attention to that fight, because David Benavidez is 6'2" with about a 74-inch arm reach, and he's absolutely humongous. The reason why people are actually entertaining this fight is because Canelo Alvarez is not the biggest guy for 168 pounds. He's really more of a middleweight. So that's why when you have these certain guys that say that, Crawford, he's going up 3 weight divisions. I mean, he might be going up 3 weight divisions. Now it'd be 2 weight divisions, but it pretty much overall would be like when Juan Manuel Marquez was brought up 2 weight classes to fight Mayweather. Because Mayweather is not really a natural 147 pounder. He really was more of a natural 135 to 140 pounder. It would be the same here. And that's why when Canelo beat Jermell Charlo's ass, that's why I always say that people make the excuse that, Jermell was brought up 2 weight classes and he was clearly way undersized. Well, we can make the valid excuse that Canelo is more adjusted to fighters at 168. So that was the advantage that Canelo had coming in. But Canelo's not really a natural 168 pounder. And that's why Jermell Charlo in that fight, he rehydrated a couple of pounds heavier than Canelo Alvarez, and he still had great stamina overall and looked pretty much just as good as what he did in almost any other fight, at least conditioning-wise, in my personal view. Now, there are certain times where a fighter balloons up a little bit more in weight than what they probably should have because they wanted to accumulate to the weight, like Crawford against Madrimov or Canelo against Bivol. But Jermell Charlo is a dude that really should have been fighting at middleweight for the longest time. And he is a little bit skinnier. He's not a guy that is a super thick 6 foot, but he's still 6 foot with about a 73 to 74 inch arm reach. He's about as big as Canelo. Because Canelo Alvarez, yes, he's girthy, but he's shorter than Jermell Charlo by about 4 damn inches. Actually, a little bit over 4 inches. So that's why I say Jermell Charlo and Canelo, people say, Canelo had this massive size advantage. No, he didn't. Because Jermell Charlo, once again, is a guy that could easily fight at the middleweight division. Canelo really even shouldn't be at the 168-pound weight class. But because he's so astronomically skilled, and on top of that, someone overall that has great athleticism in terms of punching power and great defensive ability at his best, he can beat certain A-grade level fighters at the 168-pound weight class. Like that once upon a time of a Caleb Plant or a Callum Smith.
On my man Bud, and again, you guys,
or even guys like Danny Jacobs and certain guys like that, guys that probably should have been at the 168-pound weight class.
No, I'm a fan of Terence Bud Crawford, man, so don't call me a hater. I'm just calling it how it is.
You see, he does it again. He says overall, don't call me a hater. Once again, you know why he has to do that? Because that's what fans are. And Terence Bud Crawford, once again, has the worst type of demographic on him. He has the pro-racial demographic overall that is going to whine, bitch, moan, and complain whenever you say something even slightly critical about Terence Bud Crawford. They're going to immediately call you a racist because they have no logical ability whatsoever. All right? So once again, fighters like Deontay Wilder, Crawford to a certain degree, and other certain guys like that, they're going to have the worst type of fan base overall to deal with whenever you try to make logical points because they're already so emotionally invested in any critical thing they're already going to take immediately and just assume that you're coming from a racial or a racist point of view. And a lot of the times you cannot really deal with those type of people.
I'm thinking, okay, why chase the Canelo fight so much? Yeah, he fought Madrimov at 154, a while back now when they did that big card in LA. But why chase Canelo? Why not face, what's his name? Virgil Ortiz Jr. Why not?
Well, when we talk about the Virgil Ortiz fight, I had heard that Virgil Ortiz said that he was not ready for Crawford quite as of yet, so I'm not going to criticize Crawford too much for that. But he could have fought possibly Duran Butenis, but Crawford stated that there was nothing in it for him. You know why Crawford stated that once again? Because he's thinking on the same lines as Canelo Alvarez. Crawford can state all this bullshit all he wants to about overall how, people just criticize my resume, all the guys that I fought were super good and great, but overall, there's always a criticism. And listen, to a degree, that's true. Certain people overall will always criticize your resume because you're a great fighter, and they're always looking to tear you down. But I don't give a shit what Terence Bud Crawford says. He realizes even in his own heart that he does not have the strongest of resumes. He looks at his own resume and he realizes that, 20 years later on down the line, people are not going to take a look at Crawford's resume and say, oh, wow, do you remember when Crawford beat Ricky Burns? Do you remember when he beat a washed-up Amir Khan and a Kell Brook? Do you remember when he beat Julius Ndongo? No one's going to give a shit about those wins, man. No one cares. The wins that people care about on Crawford's resume are Yuriorkis Gamboa, Victor Postol, Errol Spence Jr., Sean Porter, and Israel Madrimov. Those are the main wins that they care about. The problem is that those are really the only wins that people really care about. The majority of boxing fans don't give a shit that Terence Bud Crawford ended up defeating some fighter from Africa named Julius Ndongo that ended up getting 2 belts over a very B or C grade level Russian fighter in Edward Troyanowski that really no one remembers to this day, and a Ricky Burns overall that pretty much was a little bit over the hill, and on top of that, someone that was never, exceptionally talented anyway. So, I mean, at least when you talk about boxing champion standards. So Terence Bud Crawford wants this fight. The reason why he wants this fight is because he also wants to be remembered on the Floyd Mayweather Jr. level. He also wants to be remembered as debatably the greatest of all time. Are you going to be remembered as the greatest of all time if you end up defeating Virgil Ortiz or Duran Butenis, which, by the way, at this particular age for Terence Bud Crawford, at 37 years old, who I do believe is slowing down as a fighter, is that really going to be something that's going to make you be remembered as the greatest of all time? And those are both two very potentially losable fights for you. And that's why I say Canelo and Crawford are looking at it in the same way. Canelo looks at it and says, am I going to be remembered as the greatest fighter of all time if I fight David Benavidez and David Morrell beat both of those guys? And on top of that, those are both very losable fights for me. They're not fights that are guaranteed wins. Those are both very dangerous fights for me. Would I rather do that, or would I rather possibly face the guy that's completely undisputed at heavyweight or light heavyweight, and David Benavidez possibly loses to one of those guys, or whoever wins, I can basically state that if I win that fight, that I beat the guy that many people claim that I was avoiding. So basically, I'm going to get even extra credit. Terence Bud Crawford looks at it the same way. Terence Bud Crawford overall states that, would I rather get in the ring with Duran Butenis, who's not looked at as a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter by anybody really in the sport of boxing, other than really the LDBC and new media. If I beat him, certain people can really make the excuse that he was too green and that he hadn't really fought anybody before. And on top of that, he's extremely dangerous. Would I rather take that fight or Virgil Ortiz, or would I rather possibly take the Canelo fight? Not only do I get a massive payday, but if I end up losing the fight, my legacy isn't really going to be affected whatsoever, even in terms by the casual boxing fans, because then I can just get the excuse that I was clearly undersized, which he will be against Canelo Alvarez. But if I win over Canelo Alvarez, there's always going to be talks about me, and I'm always going to be remembered within the same realm as Floyd Mayweather and some of those other all-time greats in terms of the debatable greatest of all time. That's the way that Terence Bud Crawford is thinking it, because there's no other fighter that he can fight at this stage in his career. There's no other fight that he can just fight and state, okay, if I beat that guy, I'm going to be in the same conversation as those fighters. You can tell when Crawford talks that he wants to be remembered in the same conversation as those fighters. And Crawford is a little bit insecure about his resume. And listen, at the end of the day, it just is what it is. He doesn't have the strongest of resumes. His fanboys can try to prop it up all they want to, but at the end of the day, even they realize that his resume is not the strongest. That's why they have to try to push so goddamn hard that he's so far and above Usyk or Canelo, and he's really not. It is what it is, especially because he does not have the resume of either of those fighters. But that is the reason why, in my view, Crawford wants the Canelo fight, because there's only one fight that he can really even take that is even going to approximate him to the same level of a Mayweather or those other guys. It's Canelo Alvarez, because he realizes that Canelo not only is going to give him, certain perks like a payday, which I think it's a perk, but I don't think it's the main reason why he's taking it. If he beats Canelo, his name is always going to be remembered along the likes of Sugar Ray Leonard when he beat Hagler, Mayweather when he beat Canelo, and other great fighters like Pacquiao and Cotto, and Roy Jones Jr., and certain guys like that. He's always going to be remembered with those guys. There's no other fighter that he can beat right now from anywhere from 154 to 168 that would give him that same appraisal. It has to be Canelo, because Canelo Alvarez is looked at as debatably the greatest of this generation. He's looked at as an all-time great level fighter and an astronomically skilled fighter. And Crawford realizes that. He realizes, once again, how the casual fans and how most fans look at it. And he knows how a lot of fans look at his resume.
Not fight Boots Ennis. Why not go after these other dudes? Hell, a rematch with Errol Spence. Obviously, we don't need to see that, but I'm just saying.
No, I'm not trying to see that either, man. Like, no offense against Errol Spence, but I really don't need to see his head getting bopped around like a pinball machine overall, or like a ball in a pinball machine over like what he did against Terence Crawford. And no offense against Errol Spence Jr., but, we really might have to take a look at Errol Spence Jr., and we might have to reassess his skill set a little bit. Because out of any other top 10 pound-per-pound fight that I've seen between two fighters that could have been potentially top 10 pound-per-pound, I mean, literally, honestly, within the history of boxing, Errol Spence probably had the worst performance that I can ever personally remember. Floyd Mayweather Jr. was relatively dominant over Manny Pacquiao, but at least Manny Pacquiao wasn't knocked down in the fight, and at least he won about 3 to 4 rounds in that fight. When Oscar De La Hoya and Sugar Shane Mosley fought, I mean, Shane Mosley, he ended up beating Oscar, but at least it was about 8 rounds to 4, and I don't think that either fighter ended up getting knocked down within the fight. Roberto Duran and Sugar Ray Leonard was very competitive and an entertaining fight. Sergey the Crusher Kovalev versus Andre Ward was a very competitive fight that could have went either way in the first fight, at least in my personal view. And when you talk about other fights, Canelo versus Golovkin, both of those fights were classic fights. The first fight was a fight that some people would debate could have went either way. I would debate that Golovkin probably should have just edged it out. And then the second fight, some people also would debate that it could have went either way. I thought that Canelo just edged it out. So we honestly might have to reassess it, because in all honesty, the only other top 10 pound-for-pound fight that I can really remember that was that much of an ass-whooping was really Vasily Lomachenko versus Guillermo Rigondeaux. But at least Rigondeaux has the side excuse that he was outside probably by about a weight class or two. But I mean, I guess we can kind of say Jermell Charlo versus Canelo Alvarez, but Jermell Charlo was not really looked at on the same level as Errol Spence Jr. Everyone knew that Jermell Charlo was a flawed fighter, but Errol Spence Jr., the way that he was looked at, we kind of have to reassess him as a fighter. And I never really thought that he was the most skilled fighter on the planet, but after that ass whooping that he took, we kind of have to reassess his skill set. Because no offense, but dude, like, you were supposed to be a top 5 hands down pound-for-pound fighter in the world, and you literally got your ass whooped.
Why not go that route at this point of your career? Why go at Canelo Alvarez? Because the situation is just silly, yo. No matter.
And what we figured out about Errol Spence Jr. in that fight, which is kind of what I've always seen with him, but it was even worse against Crawford because of the type of style that Crawford had and the skills that he had. What we figured out about Spence is that, first of all, he's not the greatest counterpuncher. He's a guy that can counterpunch to a degree, but he's not a guy that can fight great in a multitude of styles. In my personal view, he has to mainly break you down. Whether he has to be on the back foot or whether he has to be on the front foot. But that's what Errol Spence mainly likes to do. He likes to break you down. Now, can he outbox certain guys that probably are not on the same level of him in terms of boxing or boxing IQ, like a Danny Garcia? Yeah, he can do that. Can he do certain things, like that against Mikey Garcia, someone that probably doesn't belong at 147? Yeah, he can do that. But can he do that against someone like a Crawford or something like that? No.
How you try to chop it up, it's just silly. It's a lose-lose for Canelo. It's a win-win for Terence Crawford. But, and this is my...
I agree with that.
with it, and this kind of.
But I think that Canelo Alvarez is looking at the fight and stating that, okay, now that Terence Bud Crawford is actually one of the 154-pound weight class, there actually is something in it for me. And I think taking a look at it from the outside looking in, if you're from Canelo's perspective, once Terence Bud Crawford ended up winning the 154-pound title, Canelo can say, okay, we can maybe try to make this fight look a little bit like Floyd Mayweather Jr. versus me back in the day, or make it into a Sugar Ray Leonard versus Marvin Hagler type of fight. We can promote it. And overall, if I end up whooping Terence Bud Crawford's ass, he might have a little bit of the size excuse, but there's also going to be a certain amount of casual fans that state that Canelo Alvarez, beat him because of the skill set. Canelo realizes, and once again, a certain amount of these people realize, once again, how their legacy is going to be looked at, not only by certain pundits, but casual fans. Because most people don't rank things off a certain logic or objectivity. Narratives end up getting traveled for many, many, many years because most people don't really know what the hell they're talking about in general. So once again, certain narratives get carried for many, many, many years. Sports pretty much is a very big political game. And I think that Canelo and both Crawford are looking at it from the political standpoint and stating, Canelo says, okay, if I beat Terence Bud Crawford and I completely dominate him and knock him out, pretty much certain people, at least a lot of the boxing public, that state that he was clearly better than me or greater than me, especially if I dominate him, a lot of those guys are pretty much going to go to the wayside. Sure, there's going to be the size excuse, but the certain people overall that are promoting that he was more skilled than me and way more skilled than me, that's pretty much going to die down if I end up whooping his ass. And then if I end up winning that fight, then later on, if I end up possibly beating the light heavyweight class, or the light heavyweight champion that beat all the guys like David Benavidez, or the winner of the Morrell versus Benavidez fight, and it better beats Bivol in a rematch, and if I somehow beat Beterbiev, I can be in that same conversation as the greatest fighter of all time. I beat Terence Bud Crawford, who ended up being one of the greatest fighters of my generation and debatably the greatest to a certain amount of people. And then I'm a 5'7" guy that ends up beating, a guy that is looked at as great at 175. I would be remembered as the greatest fighter ever. And I think that that's the way that Canelo Alvarez is looking at it. Once again, is it all completely logical? No, but once again, the average person is not that logical. They're not that objective. They're not going to take a look at things that realistically. And Canelo Alvarez and Terence Bud Crawford both realize that.
Obsessed me, man. One thing that we got to remember, we like giving, myself included, I'll be real on this one, right? We tend to give Terence Crawford a lot more credit than that he is due, according to his resume.
Agreed, sir. Thank you for saying that, because I get these Terence Bud Crawford fanboys all the time that say, you don't know what you're talking about. What about when Crawford beat Ricky Burns and beat Joyce Ondango? Dude, no one gives a fuck about those wins. Ricky Burns is not an A-grade level fighter. Never has been, never will be. Is what it is. All right, Joyce Ondango is not an A-grade fighter. Never has been, never will be. Like I said, I've already named Terence Bud Crawford's 5 A-grade level wins.
Now, if you watch the sport of boxing, right, if you're a boxing fan, you will not deny the fact that Terence Crawford is a great boxer. You will not deny the fact that he has a high ring IQ. You will not deny the fact that he is an elite fighter, right? We could all agree on that. At least most of us can.
Absolutely. Terence Bud Crawford is an all-time grade level fighter. He's debatably the greatest of his era, and he's one of the most skilled and one of the most dominant fighters of all time. He deserves all those accolades, and he deserves all those acclamations, no doubt about it.
Right? There's only one problem with it. His resume, if you have not watched Bud for years, his resume does not say that. I'm going to keep...
Agreed, sir. And once again, the Terence Bud Crawford fanboys, they can throw a hissy fit or throw a tantrum all they want to, but they even know that, and that's why they get so sensitive about that. But anyway.
100 with you guys. Terence Bud Crawford's resume is made up of one man. I'm not saying he only fought one good fighter, but let's be real.
Well, I'll disagree with that point a little bit. I'm not going to say that Terence Bud Crawford's resume is only built up of one fighter. Like, that's when certain people overall try to pull the Vasily Lomachenko narrative out of their ass, and then all of a sudden say that, oh, well, Lomachenko really lost all the big fights in his career, right? So we're just going to completely ignore when he beat the shit out of Nicholas Walters, Guillermo Rigondeaux, Jorge Linares, and Gary Russell Jr., as if those guys weren't looked at as A-grade level fighters or big threats at the time. Like, come on, give me a break.
Realistic. It's literally made up of one man, and that one man is obviously...
But I understand what the man is stating. The one fighter that people are really going to remember Terence Bud Crawford for is that Errol Spence Jr. fight. And the Crawford fanboys, they always tried to make this bullshit that, oh, Crawford doesn't need Errol Spence Jr. No, he needed Errol Spence, and Crawford knew that he needed Errol Spence Jr. because no one would have really given a shit about the career of Terence Bud Crawford, at least as much, had he fought these guys like Sean Porter and Victor Postol and Gamboa, but he never got that fight against Errol Spence Jr. To be an all-time great level fighter, to be looked at as someone that is all-time great, you need overall that story arc. You need to be having that Batman Joker story arc, that Lex Luthor Superman story arc. You need to have that type of story arc. You have to have it. And if you don't have that, if you don't beat your counterpart or the villain or the hero of your day, then you're not going to be remembered as all-time great. When you take a look at Sugar Ray Leonard, he had Duran, he had Tommy Hearns, he had Marvin Hagler. That's why he's remembered. Muhammad Ali had George Foreman, he had Sonny Liston, he had those guys. That's why he's remembered. Canelo Alvarez, he had Gennady Golovkin, he had Lara, he had some of the other guys. That's why he's remembered. Crawford really didn't have a great counterpart other than really Errol Spence Jr., so he needed him. Terence Bud Crawford, overall, in order for his career to actually be complete, at least as an all-time great level fighter, he needed Errol Spence Jr. Because if not, then he would have been looked at, it's almost like a great food dish. It would have been looked at as a great food dish. Like, it would have been looked at as something that would have been, a great meal, like 4 stars out of 5 or 4.5 stars out of 5. But in order for it to be, perfecto, or in order for it to be, delicious, or, the perfect meal, one of the great ones that is going to be up there with a Gordon Ramsay dish or something like that, with the perfect amount of seasonings and spices and meat and potatoes and all that other stuff, he needed to finish it and garnish it with Errol Spence Jr.'s win. With that win over Errol Spence Jr., that's what he needed. And that's what now puts him with one of the boxers that's always going to be talked about. In order to be an all-time great level boxer, you need that counterpart win. And Terence Bud Crawford didn't have it before Errol Spence Jr. So I understand what the man is stating.
Errol Spence Jr., and obviously he beat the crap out of Errol Spence Jr., and obviously there was no denying that when he did what he had to do, he completely fried the big fish, whatever. The only problem is that
he didn't just fry the big fish. He pretty much flew him to outer space and threw him into the sun. He completely fried that man. Like I said, Errol Spence Jr., relatively great fighter. But, that's why I also state, like, certain people, I get on my channel and they state that, oh, well, do you truly believe that Canelo is just going to knock out Crawford because, Canelo hasn't knocked anybody out in years and, all this other stuff. Listen, what I'm going to tell you is this. Canelo Alvarez is not only going to be the strongest and the biggest fighter that Terence Bud Crawford has ever fought, at least in terms of weight. He's going to be the most talented and the most skilled and the most intelligent fighter that Terence Bud Crawford has ever fought. Errol Spence Jr., in terms of a boxing great and boxing talent, he's not on the level of a Canelo Alvarez. He's just not. He doesn't have the level of head movement. He doesn't have the level of defense. He doesn't overall have the level, to be quite honest with you, even in multi-dimensions, as a Canelo Alvarez. And Canelo is not someone that, in my view, fights super great within multi, styles, but he fights good enough and great enough. He can fight on the back foot, even though he has slow feet. And he's definitely great on the front foot. Canelo is a great all-around fighter, and he can fight someone within a multitude of ways. Maybe not as great as someone like a Mayweather, or maybe not even as great as someone like a Crawford to a certain degree, But when it comes down to it overall, Canelo Alvarez can still do it to a great degree. He is going to be the most talented and the most intelligent fighter that Terence Bud Crawford has ever fought. And that's a big part of the reason also why Crawford needs that. Because once again, in order to be remembered as all-time great, Crawford is always already going to be remembered as one of those guys, but in order to be remembered as Floyd, you need multiple counterparts. And Terence Bud Crawford, in order to be remembered on the level of an Ali, something like that, you're going to have at least 2 fights to where people said, wow, overall, you defeated 2 top 10 pound-per-pound level fighters. That's what he's going to need. He has that one win over Errol Spence Jr., which is very nice, but his resume is a little bit thin, and that's why Terence Bud Crawford realizes that he needs Canelo. Because there's going to be no other win that's going to equate to anything even remotely close as what a possible win over Canelo Alvarez would be.
Whatever reason, and this is real common in the sport, we like to hold different fighters to different standards, right? For a while there, we wanted to call Terence Bud Crawford #1 pound for pound when he beat Errol Spence. But at the same time, you got other fighters that were doing more than him, than Terence Bud Crawford, being more active, have way better resumes, and somehow we just wanted to hold them to a higher standard. And why is that?
Well, let me talk about 2 points that you brought up there. The first thing overall that you brought up overall is that there were certain fighters that had way better resumes than Crawford. Now, resume to me is the quality of fighters that you beat. Are they A grade? Are they B grade? Are they C grade? What are they? What is it? There are only 2 fighters that I think within recency that you can really claim have better resumes than Terence Bud Crawford. Canelo Alvarez and Alexander Usyk. Now, are there certain other fighters that maybe you can debate it? Maybe. Like, you can talk about, Artur Beterbiev. He might be up there. And Devin Haney, of course, he's had some decent runs against some A-grade level fighters, sure. But Crawford overall does have 5 A-grade level wins, and that Errol Spence win is one of the bigger wins within recent boxing history. So once again, I'm not going to claim that there's a certain amount of boxers that have better resumes, but I think that Usyk and Canelo Alvarez, yes, you can claim it with those two fighters. Some people, of course, would say Inoue, but I don't think that Inoue has 5 A-grade level wins in his career. I would say that maybe he has about 3. I would give him Nonito Donaire, which is about A-. I would give him maybe Marlon Tapales because he beat a very talented Uzbekistani fighter with a great amateur pedigree, and MJ, a fight that everyone wanted to see versus Inoue, but then he lost to Tapales. So I'll give him Tapales. And I also think that I would give him, of course, Stephen Coolboy Fulton. So he has about 3 A-grade level wins, but even some of those are a little bit debatable. Now, maybe some could debate Louis Neri as well, but I mean, that's kind of a debate. I think that Louis Neri, although talented, is a relatively one-dimensional fighter. But I mean, maybe I'd have to watch more of him. I don't know. But the second point that he brought up is said that we like to put Crawford to a higher standard. Why is that? Listen, when you talk about every demographic of athlete and fighter, especially depending on race, there are certain things, certain privileges, and also certain downfalls that happens with certain fighters. And when you talk about certain black fighters, sometimes they can be ranked on a higher level, or their resume can be looked at as greater than what they actually are, or they can be looked at as slicker or more defensively responsible than what they actually are, because that's what some of the black fighters of old were like. So people take a look once again at someone like a Canelo, and they say that, oh, Canelo was a very entertaining fighter. He gets in wars, a lot of sort of stuff. But Canelo's not really that type of fighter. Canelo overall, he's a very entertaining fighter. Don't get it twisted. But Canelo Alvarez is not a guy that likes to get in wars. Canelo was a slick boxer. He has slow feet, yes, but Canelo Alvarez is not a guy that is like a Marco Antonio Barrera or an Eric Morales that would go toe-to-toe with you or likes to go to war. Canelo Alvarez is a guy that wants to outbox you. He wants to outbox you like a Mayweather, or he wants to outbox you overall like a Crawford, something like that. Now, of course, is he a little bit more on the front foot, than some of the other guys, probably like a Crawford or a Mayweather at times? Yeah, probably. But Canelo Alvarez is not a guy like a Marco Antonio Barrera that would just go toe-to-toe with you or something like that. Canelo Alvarez, he can do that at times, but that's not really his preferred, style. He wants to outbox you, and people take a look at Crawford and they state that, oh, well, because he's an all-time great black fighter from America, he must be like a Floyd Mayweather, or he must be like a Pernell Whitaker. So he must be, one of the great defensive fighters, and he's not. Terence Bud Crawford is not a tremendously great defensive fighter. He's just not. He's a very good defensive fighter at his best. The best defensive performance I ever seen was against Errol Spence Jr. Now, in my view, Spence was a bit slow in that fight, but it is what it is. But Crawford is not a tremendous defensive fighter. He gets credit overall for being this great defensive fighter because, once again, that's what people expect out of elite-level black American fighters. But that's not what he is. Terence Bud Crawford is a very good defensive fighter at his best. He's never been great. He's not a Pernell Sweepy Whitaker. He's not a Mayweather. He's not one of those guys. It just is what it is. And when you talk about defense, Canelo Alvarez and both probably Alexander Usyk at their peak, yeah, they're probably both better defensive fighters than him. But there would be certain things that Crawford, of course, would be better than those guys as well. But that's why I say when people talk about Crawford, skill for skill, just being way over those guys, no, that's not the case. Canelo and Usyk, even in terms of the skill set and dominance, can compete with Crawford as well, or at least the skill set. But once again, people take a look at Crawford and they assume immediately, because many of the elite black fighters of old, they have great resumes, so they assume overall that he must have one, or by osmosis they do that. That's what ends up happening in a lot of sports, But once again, that's why we have to be careful, because many people overall, they can kind of get into that mold, or they go by stereotypes, and sometimes it's just not fitting.
That I'll never know.
So that's why I say, even though black fighters, even though they get a lot of criticism and double standards against them, there's sometimes where there's also a little privilege that they get. And they're not the only ones that have privilege, of course, or certain downtrods, of course. Caucasian fighters and Latino fighters have the same thing. Latino fighters may be looked at, as more entertaining, or ones that are more blood and guts, even if they may not be of that particular style. And Caucasian fighters, sometimes they can be ranked, a little bit higher than what they deserve to be at times. They're not really looked at as quote unquote boring or something like that. So once again, every particular demographic and race has to deal with their own particular stereotypes, whether they be positive or negative. Terence Bud Crawford deals with a little bit of both. Certain people call him boring or a runner. That's one of the negative stereotypes. But then certain people uplift his resume as if it's a Mayweather-like resume. It is not. And certain people say that he's more defensively responsible, and more defensively great than what he actually is, and he's not.
I don't understand what they look at, and this is why the YouTube and all the.
For example, if you take a look at NBA basketball, people take a look at Luka Doncic, and what were people calling him? They weren't calling him LeBron James. They weren't calling him Oscar Robinson, and he's really more like those players than what he really was a Larry Bird. But people compared him to Larry Bird because why? Because he's a Caucasian player. So most people are not intelligent enough overall to really make the right comparison. They just make a comparison off of surface level based stuff. In order to understand that, you'd have to understand the psychology of a certain amount of people, because the average person overall really doesn't rank things off of any evidence. They just rank things off of certain things that they see on the surface, and they just make correlations with.
People that have channels here, we're the ones that keep it 100 because we don't got, all these other DAZN, ESPN paying us to do what we do. I don't make nothing off of this channel. I simply love the sport of boxing. However, we do blow his name up way more than we should if we're looking at his resume, okay? If we're looking at his opponents. Again, it's literally based off of Errol Spence Jr. Now, obviously, Terence Crawford at this time, 37 years old, man, he wasted a lot of time in his career. Yeah, we could blame Bob Arum and Top Rank, but at the end of the day, Terence Crawford re-signed to Top Rank after he wasn't getting the fights that he wanted and all of that. So that.
I agree with you, sir. And I've had certain people in my comment section say, oh, well, it wouldn't have mattered. The PBC fighters would have ducked him anyway. Right, but why would you resign with Bob Arum? Bob Arum is a guy that is known for fucking over and screwing over his fighters for a very long time. Oscar De La Hoya left his ass because of that. Floyd Mayweather left his ass because of that. Mikey Garcia left his ass because of that. You couldn't see the pattern? And then on top of that, Bob Arum has stated that he does not like to work with Al Heyman, that he hates the PBC and hates them, and it is severely difficult to get to work with him. Why the hell overall would you resign with Bob Arum when all the big boy welterweights in Danny Garcia, Errol Spence, Sean Porter, Keith One-Time Thurman, and all the other guys, they're all over there with the PBC. Why the hell would you want us to resign with Top Rank and make your road even a little bit harder? Like, why would you do that?
That's Terence Bud Crawford's fight. We can't blame nobody.
So people overall can state all they want to about, oh, well, the PBC fighters would have ducked him anyway. Well, we can state that if Terence Bud Crawford actually signed to the PBC. But he was signed with Bob Arum, a guy that really has had no particular interest or not a great interest in working with the PBC. So why in the hell overall would you re-sign with him? So that's why I blame Terence Bud Crawford a little bit for that. A big part of the reason why his resume is looked at as thin, not only because it is, but it's partially his fault. Had he signed with the PBC a little bit earlier, he could have potentially gotten a Danny Garcia fight or a Keith Thurman fight or something like that. And had those guys not fought him, then guess what? The pressure would have been even more on them. That's what you do, if you really want to try to get those big fights. And I'm not saying that Crawford avoided that necessarily. I just don't think overall that he was, smart enough overall to really see the forest through the trees on that one.
For that.
Business-wise. And, of course, I'm not insulting the man's intelligence. He seems like a very intelligent dude, at least when it comes to boxing. And, of course, the man is a boxing genius. To be fair, I don't know his intelligence level in other areas, but he seems like a relatively intelligent dude. So I'm not insulting the dude's intelligence. But I'm just saying that business-wise, some people just don't get it on the same level as others. Demetrius Andrade is another one. Very smart boxer, but in terms of the business side of boxing, dumb as a pile of rocks.
That's what he decided to do. Now, this is the end of his career, right? And like I said, man, I'm going to use the example again. He wants to go out like Carlito's way, right? He wants to go in there, he wants to make a bag, and he wants to fly off into the sunset. But this...
I don't necessarily agree with that. I think overall what I would really compare it to, and that's one of the classic movies. You could tell that this dude, you can tell that this dude is more than likely a Puerto Rican from New York, from the Bronx or something like that. I have so many friends overall from the Bronx that remind me of him. Good people, by the way. But Carlito's Way, by the way, for those of you that never watched that movie, excellent movie. One of the best movies by Al Pacino. Not a movie that is talked about a whole lot today, but one of the best movies, in my view, that he ever did. And Al Pacino was a classic actor. Now, of course, he's not of Latino descent from my knowledge. I think that he's from Italian descent. So he's a Caucasian, but of course, because of his look and on top of that, his acting ability, he was able to get away with playing certain, Latino roles like Tony Montana, the Cuban, I believe in Scarface. And of course, what was his name? Carlito Brigante, I believe. And what the fuck is that? Carlito's Way. My bad. Jesus. Having amnesia here. But anyways, great movie, by the way. Starring Al Pacino, Sean Penn. I'm a big movie buff myself. Classic movie. John Leguizamo, I believe, another Latino actor who eventually would play Sid in Ice Age. You know, all those guys. Great, fantastic movie.
This is the only problem with that. And I'm going to be real. It is a real, and I hate saying this, man, but it is a real weak move to go after Canelo Alvarez. A really weak move to go after Canelo. Let me explain why. Not because Canelo is no pushover. We all know that Canelo versus a Terence Crawford, it's a mismatch. It's a mismatch. However you want to chop and screw it, you can make the argument that Terence...
And that's how the majority of boxing fans really take a look at this fight. But Dante's Boxing Nation's ass, with his snake ass, he's gonna try to frame it overall like so many of these fighters and boxing pundits are really picking Terence Bud Crawford to try to make Canelo Alvarez look overrated. But Dante is actually helping Canelo Alvarez's case, and I'm not sure if he knows it or not. But don't be surprised once again if Canelo Alvarez is actually slipping some of these guys like Dante and some of these other guys a paycheck, because believe it or not, sometimes there is such a thing as controlled opposition. Now, I don't think that Dante's Boxing Nation is doing that, because I think that some of the things that he's alleging, it wouldn't really help Canelo Alvarez's career to allege those things. But keep in mind that sometimes there is a thing known as controlled opposition. Meaning what? That, you know, sometimes some of the rap beefs that you may see in the public or the media, that they're not as quote unquote beefing, or they're not as angry at each other as what they may allege. They may be doing it as a publicity stunt because, of course, as some people may say, there's no such thing as bad publicity. You know, so once again, there is such a thing as known as controlled opposition. But the thing is that I don't think Dante is doing that, but Dante overall once again is trying to frame it like most people are picking Crawford. That's not what's happening.
Crawford has this.
And you notice that he doesn't mention that Demetrius Bubo Andrade picked Canelo over Crawford, or that Madrimov picked Canelo over Crawford, and that Madrimov said that Terence Bud Crawford's level of power was regular in his fight. And that's why, you know, certain people overall say that, oh, well, Crawford, you know, he's going to be, you know, an excellent boxer, you know, overall, and he just knocked out Spence and blah, 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 all sort of stuff. Right, but people do, like, dude, people don't get it. When you move up a weight class, and on top of that, you're moving up to Canelo Alvarez. Now, Canelo, of course, is more of a middleweight. I get it. But, dude, Canelo Alvarez might have the greatest chin that I've ever personally seen for any all-time great fighter. I've only seen Canelo Alvarez really hurt 1 or 2 times in his career. At least really, like, stumbled or wobbly. One time was against Miguel Cotto's older brother, I believe Jose Cotto, when he was very young in his career. And then the other time, I believe, was against Gennady Triple G Golovkin in the rematch. Other than that, Canelo Alvarez pretty much has a spotless record in terms of overall being wobbled or actually hurt in a fight. At least overall seriously wobbled or seriously hurt. You know, Canelo Alvarez has an extraordinary chin. And then on top of that, he's used to fighting guys and punchers like Edgar Berlanga, Jaime Munguia, Danny Jacobs, Gennady Golovkin, Sergey Kovalev, Dmitry Bivol. Dude, even with all those guys, Canelo Alvarez hasn't even been knocked down once in his career. You think Terence Bud Crawford, who couldn't even really hurt Israel Madrimov that badly in his last fight, you think that Terence Bud Crawford is going to fight Canelo Alvarez, who's going to weigh anywhere from 180 to 185, a guy that is adjusted to those punches? You think that Crawford is just going to go in there, take all those punches to the arms and the elbows, a power that he has never felt before, then on top of that probably be about 170 pounds, like what he was against Israel Madrimov, you know, be slower than what he regularly is, maybe not have the same level of stamina, and that he's just going to last throughout the whole entire fight, or that he's going to completely outbox Canelo Alvarez? Good luck with that one.
You could make the argument that he could pull a Floyd, 2 whole different worlds. We could get into that on another time. We could do that on a live, whatever. This is my thing with it. This is a win-win for Terence Crawford and a lose-lose for Canelo. Now, why do I say?
I someone agree with that. But I think that Canelo Alvarez is a little bit more open in the fight now, especially ever since Crawford won at 154, because now at least he can overall state, well, at least Crawford is only moving up 2 weight classes. And people really look at me overall like I'm not a natural 168 pounder anyway, so, you know, it is what it is. You know, but at least Crawford is only moving up 2 weight classes. There was no way that Canelo was going to take that fight with Crawford moving up 3 weight classes without him doing shit at 154, because there was going to be nothing in it for him. If he whoops Terence Bud Crawford's ass, people are just going to say you beat a dude that moved up 3 weight classes. So Canelo at least needs the narrative to be there that he beat a man moving up 2 weight classes, because people have gotten credit for beating up a guy or beating a guy that has moved up 2 weight classes, such as when he beat Jamel Charlo, such as when overall Rigondeaux fought Lomachenko, such as when Mosley, of course, was able to beat Oscar De La Hoya, and such as when Roberto Duran was able to beat Sugar Ray Leonard. You know, so once again, Canelo at least needed that to happen. He wasn't going to fight Terence Bud Crawford moving up 3 weight classes. He beats him, and overall, there's nothing in it for him.
That Because whether he wins or loses, Terence Crawford is going to get a bag. Okay, if he fights Canelo, it's the jackpot.
Well, he's going to get a bag, and that's a perk of the fight, but I don't think that that's the main reason why Crawford is taking the fight. Because when I take a look at the other guys that I thought either wanted a payday or moved up 2 weight classes out of nowhere, it usually overall was because they were trying to avoid somebody at their particular weight class, or they really overall were ready to retire. Now, I think that Crawford is ready to retire soon, but once again, I don't think that overall he's doing this just to take a payday or to avoid somebody. When I took a look at Mikey Garcia moving up 2 weight classes to fight Errol Spence, it was pretty much to avoid Lomachenko. Although the LDBC and new media channels won't tell you that shit, that's what it was for. When Kell Brook was doing it to fight Golovkin, it was pretty much to avoid Errol Spence Jr. so he could have the excuse later on down the line and say, oh, well, I probably wasn't the same ever since that I lost to Gennady Golovkin. That pretty much overall was the excuse. Now there are certain fighters when they move up 2 weight classes because they are trying to achieve greatness, or unfortunately, they don't have anyone else to fight. They don't have another option. Like when Guillermo Rigondeaux fought Lomachenko, because he was avoided by literally everybody within that fight. And isn't it so interesting how people always talk about someone like an Andrade being so avoided? Guillermo Rigondeaux was literally avoided by everybody, from Leo Santa Cruz to Carl Frampton to everybody that was a notable name. And even he ended up getting a couple of big fights against Emilio Donaire and Vasily Lomachenko. So how come Demetrius Andrade can't even get one former fucking champion on his resume other than David Benavidez? Give me a break.
He doesn't have to fight after it again.
But once again, Terence Bud Crawford, not only is he going to get a big payday, but on top of that, if he loses, people will just say, oh, well, good job, mate. You tried. You were completely outsized in that fight, and no harm, no foul. But if he wins that fight, then he's remembered debatably as the greatest fighter of all time. And once again, isn't that so particularly interesting how Dante and some of these other guys with the LDBC and new media, they try to claim that Canelo is so overrated and all sort of stuff, but if Crawford beats him, he's the greatest fighter of all time, debatably. How does that make any sense? You say that Canelo Alvarez is an average fighter, a guy that is super overrated, a guy that really isn't that talented or that particularly skilled, but then Terence Bud Crawford beats him, someone that is, 5'7" with a 71-inch arm reach, and Crawford is, the greatest fighter of all time. Does that make any sense? If Crawford fought John Ryder at 168 pounds and beat him, and he was a champion there, would anyone say that Terence Bud Crawford is the greatest fighter of all time? So once again, that's how you know that those guys are so full of shit. But anyway.
Doesn't have to do nothing above, right? If he beats Canelo, he'll be remembered as a legend to many. If he loses to Canelo, he's going to be a legend to many because he stepped up to the plate and fought Canelo at a higher weight class at 37 years old, jumped up 3 weight classes, all of that and above. It was a win-win-win for Terence Crawford.
Agreed.
And I cannot...
The only one that can lose anything really from this is pretty much Canelo Alvarez. But let me not state that completely. Because Terence Bud Crawford, now that he's a champion at 154, Canelo Alvarez realizes once again, he's smart enough to realize, okay, I can try to frame this with the Sugar Ray Leonard and the Hagler thing. Or overall with Shane Mosley and Oscar De La Hoya, or certain things like that. And I can also, kind of frame it with me and Floyd Mayweather Jr. So if I end up beating Terence Bud Crawford, I can maybe get certain fans overall to at least somewhat forgive the loss that I had to Floyd Mayweather Jr. or make it look a little bit better. Because then I can make it and say that I improved a little bit later on in my career, and then I beat a fighter overall that was looked at as a top pound-for-pound fighter and somewhat, incriminative of that style.
Like the fact that is a high possibility of how he was looking at a fight with Canelo. Because let's be real. If you're fighting for legacy, right? Like us boxing fans, let's be real, man. We talk about the face of boxing, who could sell, this and that, but we don't base who the better fighter is off of those things. That's just kind of something we throw in for fun when we're talking about who's the biggest draw in the sport. The biggest draw doesn't equal the best fighter in the sport.
And these guys hate Canelo Alvarez's guts. and when I say these guys, I'm talking about the LDBC and new media. They can't stand Canelo Alvarez. Because Canelo Alvarez was looked at as debatably the greatest, possibly the most skilled for his era. And on top of that, he was the face of boxing, and he was a Caucasian Hispanic. They can't fucking stand his ass. That's why they try to tear down Canelo so much. Because he won overall in so many categories. They can't stand his ass, man.
It's a whole different conversation. That's a whole different topic. If I'm Terence Bud Crawford, what are you really trying to do, dog? Are you trying to land?
He's trying to be on the same level as Mayweather and those other guys. And there's no other fighter that he's going to potentially beat for his era that is going to put him on that level. Because he realizes that his resume is thin. I don't give a shit what he says. You can tell by the way that he talks about it in interviews that he is a little bit insecure about it. And at the end of the day, it is what it is. He does have a thinner resume.
End the fight and just, get extra rich and just sail off to the sunsets? Or do you want to be like Troy, Achilles in the movie Troy? Do you want people to remember your name? I'm going to tell you
I believe that he wants people to remember his name, just in my personal view.
right now, as of right now, Terence Crawford's name is going to fade away because he's only going to be remembered for the Errol Spence Jr. fight. Yeah, he fought Victor Posto. Yeah, he fought...
Well, Terence Bud Crawford is going to be remembered for the Errol Spence Jr. fight, but he is always going to be remembered as a guy that was the first male fighter to become undisputed in 2 separate weight classes. I mean, of course we can bring up the women's, but I really don't give a shit about that because no offense, but even though the women's divisions are starting to get more talented, like a lot of those girls don't know how to fucking fight whatsoever. Like, you take a look at a certain amount of those girls in the professional circuit. I've seen guys that have just started in a boxing gym that would literally whoop their ass. Now, of course, that overall is a guy, overall, against a woman, but still, the quote-unquote professional women's fighters, those girls, if they were somehow transferred into a man's body and they had that same skill set, they wouldn't even make it into the top 30, is what it is.
He's the first one to beat Gamboa. Yeah, all of those things, they all sound good. Okay, cool. But at the end of the day, he's remembered because he beat Errol Spence Jr. in the fashion that he did beat him. We can't take that win away from him. However, is that one win enough to solidify him as a pound-for-pound great in all of the above? If we do that...
Well, it's not just that. Once again, he did beat Gamboa. He became undisputed in 2 separate weight classes. Now, in my view, was the 140-pound run a super strong run? No, it wasn't. But, he still became undisputed there.
We got to do that across the board and keep it consistent.
And like I said, Crawford is a black fighter, so people immediately are going to compare him to the likes of Ali and Mayweather and certain guys like that and automatically assume that his resume is stronger than what it actually is.
And I know damn well we're not going to do that. So I'm going to be real with y'all. It was a really weak move for them to try to go after Canelo. Now, whether it was Crawford's idea, whether it was Jive Turkey's idea, whatever.
I believe that it was Terence Bud Crawford's idea. But I think that Crawford has had this idea in his mind for a while.
It looks really weak when you chop it, screw it, and you look at it for what it is. It seems that Terence Crawford did not want to take any more risks by fighting an Ortiz, by fighting a Boots, by fighting any of these other cats. He did not want to take the risk, and he saw the easy way out. Let me go in there with Canelo. I get credit for not winning. I get credit for winning. Either way, I walk out with the bag because I highly doubt if he were to land that fight, and it looks like he's not going to land it as of right now, right? That he would fight again after that because he'd be pushing 38 by that time. That's assuming that the fight happened now. It could be 39, closer to 40, and we don't know when Father Time is going to show up. So I hate to say it, man, but Terence Crawford, I love him as a fighter, but it was a really weak move to go after Canelo. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. Let's talk about this, man. It's your boy, Truth and Absolute. Much love to you guys. God bless y'all and peace.
But anyways, that pretty much overall is about it for that video. And good video to you, sir. I think overall that he brought up a lot of good points. I disagree with him on some. But I think, though, overall that he definitely has a lot more logic. And overall that his mind is definitely more in the right place than a certain amount of these other dopes that I watch, on boxing. But, good little channel there. But what I'm going to state there, once again, do I believe that Crawford is taking the money? No, I don't. And he compared it to Carlito's Way, which is a great movie of Carlito taking the bag and trying to just go home. I think that's what Jermell Charlo was doing. I don't think that Terence Bud Crawford is doing that. I think what Terence Bud Crawford is doing is almost like a Lord of the Rings quest, to where if you take a look at it, overall it almost looks impossible on the surface. But basically, if you do it, then you're always going to be remembered as very courageous and one of the greats, in that your name is always going to be etched in history. That's what I think overall it's really more like. I can't really come up with a better comparison because I would have to think of a movie that would be a little bit more apropos, for the comparison. But, when it comes down to it overall, that's what I believe that it is, And like I said, Terence Bud Crawford, he realizes that, 20 years later on down the line, he's going to have another name on his resume to be solidified with those other guys like Mayweather and all that other stuff. The LDBC and new media can try to push him, with those guys all they want to. But most boxing fans are not going to take a look at his resume and say, wow, he beat Ricky Burns and Julius Ndango. People aren't going to give a shit about that. Mayweather's resume and Canelo's resume, for example, and Pacquiao's resume, they're always going to stand the test of time because they beat certain A-grade level fighters that people knew, for that particular era. or that were relatively talented within a multitude of weight classes. You know, Crawford does not have that. It is what it is. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. We'll see where this goes. But that's the reason overall why I wanted to review that little video. Just thought it was very particularly interesting. But anyways, thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later, and we'll see where this goes.